Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. I'd like to welcome everybody this evening to the last in our Philippine lecture series for this academic year and also for the spring term. And keep an eye open. The series will continue next year, so we'll please keep an eye out for the announcements about the series for next year, and hope you can make it at one of those talks next, starting in the fall. This evening, I'm really pleased to be able to welcome our speaker, Professor Felipe Pereda, who is the Fernando Zobel de Ayala Professor of Spanish Art in the History of Art and Architecture Department here at Harvard University. His talk this evening is entitled Fernando Zobel, Painting Across Three Continents. Now, Professor Pereda was born in Madrid. He studied at the Universidad Complutense and the Autónoma University, where he received his PhD in 1995 and taught there until 2011. More recently, he's also taught at the Instituto de Investigaciones Estéticas and also at Johns Hopkins University from 2011 to 2015. He has worked on Spanish late medieval and early modern art, art theory, image theory, and also the history of architecture. His books include La Arquitectura Elocuente in 1999, El Atlas del Rey Planeta in 2003, Images of Discord, Poetics and Politics of the Sacred Image in 15th Century Spain, published in 2007, and then the English translation in 2018. And in recent years, he's also published on other artists such as Luis de Morales, Ribera, and Zurbarán. And his recent publication is Crime and Illusion, The Art of Truth in the Spanish Golden Age, published in 2018. And he's currently has a book in press entitled Torrigiano, The Man Who Broke Michelangelo's Nose. Very intriguing title, so we'll look forward to that one. Most recently, as well, he was a co-curator of an exhibition at the Prado Museum in Madrid that was open in 2022 up until just this March, which was the Zobel exhibition entitled Zobel, The Future of the Past, which focuses on the artist's work from a transnational perspective and really goes beyond the kind of geographic limits of the three continents of Asia, North America, and Europe, where Fernando Zobel lived. I've been told that this exhibition will now travel and will be opening in Manila at the Ayala Museum in 2024. And then after that, it will travel to Singapore, where the exhibition will begin in 2025. So thank you all for joining us this evening. And now I'll turn the microphone over to Professor Pereda for his talk, Fernando Zobel, Painting Across Three Continents. And thank you again for joining us this evening, Professor Pereda.
Thank you very much. Let me see. Just a second, because I want to make sure you're seeing the slides on the bottom, right? Which you shouldn't be.
Yes, that's correct.
So I'm going to see how I can make it. So that you don't see but one. Now, right?
That's good. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so
much.
Take it away. James, thank you so much, Tenzin, too, for your help, technical support. As James was saying, this is part of a larger project that only began with the exhibition that just closed in Madrid, but will continue for the next 2 years in Manila and Singapore. And because of the different venue, but also the different audience, I'm in this new exhibition planning to address more specifically the issues of the geography and the identity of Fernando Zobel. And this today is a little bit of an experiment in some brainstorming ideas about that I'm working with. So I will very much appreciate your feedback or your critique, whatever it comes. So in 1960, an exhibition opened at the Guggenheim Museum, bringing to New York for the first time the work of a new generation of informalist abstract artists that had emerged in Spain after its tragic civil war. In the words of the catalog, the aim was to illustrate the continuing vitality of painting in Spain, showing at the same time such a vitality as connected as it connected these modern artists with the work of Goya, Diego Velázquez, and through them down to prehistoric cave paintings to Altamira. So the Guggenheim coincided in time with another exhibit, this one at the MoMA, this time curated by Franco O'Hara, entitled New Spanish Painting and Sculpture. And this one showed the work of such artists as Antonio Saura, now to the right of the screen, whose references to the old masters, Goya in this particular case, demonstrated, so thought Franco O'Hara, not only the vitality, but also the unbroken continuity of Spanish painting. Of course, both continuity and vitality were politically loaded terms in 1960. The underlying argument of both exhibitions was that Spain continued to be open to the avant-garde and to modernity, resurrecting, if I may say, after the most recent trauma of the Civil War that had ended only in 1939. The only problem being, of course, that Spain did not come out of the Civil War as a democracy, but as a fascist regime, the dictatorship of General Francisco Franco, which would in fact only come to an end with the dictator's death after almost 40 years of authoritarian regime in 1975. So it should come as no surprise that Spain's Ministry of Foreign Affairs celebrated the New York openings as a triumph of its diplomacy, helping cleaning Franco's international image. The strategy, by the way, didn't fool American art critics who reminded in the press that, and I quote, the conditions of dictatorship were incompatible with the free environment of a genuine avant-garde movement, as put by Natalie Edgar in the Art News. And of course, several of the artists that participated in these two exhibitions would later argue or claim that they had been manipulated, which is part of an ongoing debate that I don't have time to get into today. It doesn't affect my arguments in any case. So the 1960 Guggenheim and MoMA exhibits constituted landmarks of Franco's foreign affairs policy. On the one hand, projecting the simulacrum of a modern country open to the avant-garde, while on the other, defending Spain's radical cultural distinctiveness, a key element for the flourishing of its tourism industry. And I guess that many of you would have heard this slogan that we still use today of Spain is different, right? It was created in those years. So it is too surprising to find forming part of the group of artists supposedly illustrating this strongly nationalist narrative, the name of Fernando Zobel, the subject of today's lecture. Zobel, a painter that had not been born in Spain, but was born in the Philippines, an artist that had been raised in Manila and was educated in Boston, here in New England, and a man that had only moved to Madrid the year before, that is in 1959, and had only been in Spain before twice. And finally, but not last but not least, a painter that, although born in a Spanish family, and even a man that traveled with a Spanish passport, and this is exactly what I try to show today in the next minutes, an artist that was intensely invested in exploring the relation of his art to tradition, or I would say traditions, whether geographical or historical. At the same time, Zobel had struggled much of his life to define his art and his identity beyond the pressure of a nationalist agenda, which was actually, in fact, the argument of these two exhibitions, right? Whether they liked it or not. So the Guggenheim show was important for Zobel. It gave him the opportunity to present for the first time the series of what he called the big oil drawings. Those are elegant, large, sometimes very large abstract compositions, painted, or one might better say drawn, with only black pigments. And they usually have these kind of esoteric titles like Ornithopteros. And these were the result of several years of experimentation in the search of a technique collapsing two different arts, painting, but also drawing. And this was only made possible to Zobel as after making a technical invention, which consisted in painting with surgical syringes that ejected thin lines of pigment and produced the effect of an ink drawing. Rapidly executed, Zobel's black paintings are not, however, improvised. And this is important for my argument, but they were made instead following some sort of a kind of a meditated plan or idea that only the use of syringes, so he argued, helped him to keep under perfect control. And they're large and they're pretty spectacular. The result, as I'm saying, are paintings that perfectly blur the distinction between painting and drawing that lies at the very ground of the Western tradition. And this is why he called them big old drawings, right? So traditionally, the big old drawings have been analyzed at the crossroads of three complementary narratives: his Spanish identity on the one hand, his exposure to abstract expressionism here in the United States, and occasionally, three, a marginal interest in Asian calligraphy. At the exhibition recently closed at the Prado Museum, James was reminding us that it closed in March, an exhibition that I co-curated with Manuel Fontan from the March Foundation in Madrid. We have challenged this interpretation of his work by presenting Fernando Zobel along two different yet complementary axes. A historical one that tried to show his critical dialogue with painterly traditions, whether Western or Eastern, Chinese, Japanese, or European, and also a geographical axis that presented his work not as that of an abstract painter interested in Asian calligraphy, but instead as that of an artist that was fundamentally cosmopolitan and whose art was essentially translinguistic. And you will see the bottom line of my argument today will be this idea about the translinguistic and the importance of translation, both for his education, but mainly I'm using it as an instrument to understand the originality of his work. Maybe originality is not the term, the importance of his work. And I hope to show convincingly that this idea of the translinguistic connect intensely to his Filipino origins. Let me now share with you how we decided to hang the Black series paintings at the Prado. And let me see if I can show that to you. This is a short video with my cell phone at the day before the opening. This is the Black paintings. And opposite to them, we see an example of his own calligraphic painting. And to the right of the image now are two paintings made by contemporary Japanese paintings that he certainly admired. Sorry, oh yeah, here we are, right? And the two artists that were hanging in front of Zobel's paintings were one by Munakata Shiko, that you're seeing now, an artist that is maybe better known as a woodblock printmaker and calligrapher. But what interested me, not only because he was very much admired by Zobel, but because of his own Munakata Shiko's interest in post-impressionist painting, Van Gogh in particular. And by the way, the painting that we're showing, this scroll, belongs to the Harvard Art Museums. It was donated by Fernando Zobel, and it was the first work by Munakata Shiko to enter the collections of the Harvard Art Museums, which now has many more. So he was a forerunner in the interest of this museum on these artists. The other one was, again, the painting came from on loan from the Harvard Museums. There were two, but this one was one of the two amazing Morita Shiryus, which is an artist that was the founding member of the Bokunji-kai group, the so-called People of the Ink, a group that was created in the 1950s and was invented in making, and I quote from their 1952 manifesto, to resurrect calligraphy as a truly modern art. And as I will be proving later today, this was an artist that Fernando Zobel greatly admired already at the very beginning of the formation of the group. So who was Fernando Zobel, right? Or where did he come from? So let me explain briefly, because I think this is a story that will be of interest to you. So Fernando Zobel had been born in one of the oldest Spanish Filipino families, meaning by Spanish Filipino, meaning, I mean families that settled in the Philippines several generations before him, but had or kept strong connections to Spain. In fact, both his parents had been born in Spain. Enrique Zobel de Ayala, a successful empresario, to we will come back later, but also his mother, Fermina Montojo, who had been born in Seville. And both, father and mother, were connected in different ways to the colonial past, but also to the dissolution of such a legacy. In fact, his mother, Fermina Montojo, was nothing less than the daughter of the Spanish admiral that defended and surrendered Manila to the American fleet of the Commodore George Dewey at the Battle of Manila Bay, 1888. That was Fernando Zobel's grandfather. A battle that, as you all know, put an end to 350 years of Spanish colonial empire in the Philippines and opened it up again to a new 50 years period of an American colony. So raised in Spanish, but educated in English, Fernando Zobel grew up perfectly bilingual in a country in which his mother tongue, Spanish, was becoming increasingly marginal. And it might be worth remembering now, I know many of the people in the room know this very well, but some others might not, that by the end of the Spanish 3 centuries rule, less than 3% of the population of the Philippines could speak that language. People say that maybe even less. A situation that was sentenced when the 1935 Constitution gave English an official status while guaranteeing the development of a common national language that only in 1937 became Tagalog. And let me give you a quote. Like the Southeast Asia and Latin American countries, writes Vicente Rafael, the Philippines does not have a national language. Instead, it has a history of elite and state attempts to institute a national language based on Tagalog, where the last colonial language, English, continues to be hegemonic. And this comes from his book With Love and Other Essays. I know this is a controversial issue, but I want to bring the opinion of this very respected scholar. So Fernando Zobel grew in Manila in the midst of this transition, which made that his elitist education encompassed all possible contradictions and tensions of this colonial heritage that was, of course, his own and that of his family. More important, however, this did not detain him from actively participating in the search for a Filipino cultural identity in the aftermath and on the occasion of the independence of the Philippines, July the 4th, 1946. And this is what Manila, the city in which he had been raised, looked like at the end of World War II, maybe the second largest destroyed city in the world of that war. Now, as I recently learned, and I'm afraid this episode has been very much ignored in the literature, in September, so that's only the month after of the independence, September 1946, Zobel collaborated in a publication by the Filipino poet Rafael Zulueta da Costa. The book is called Filipino Contemporary Verse and Prose. It was a journal, it was meant to be just the first issue of a periodical, which unfortunately had no continuity. And this Filipino Contemporary Verse and Prose was to be devoted to the search for a poetic language for the new independent nation. By the way, this is an extremely rare publication. It is amazing that we have one copy at the Houghton Library. I have found no other, and I've talked to many Filipino scholars. No one had any idea of this pretty amazing book. So the book was edited by Zulueta da Costa, who of course is no other than the famous author of De Molave, the book that was published for the first time in 1941, a poem, and that takes its title from President Manuel Quezon's speech on, and I quote, the need for regenerating the Filipino national character, emancipating it from the subservience of both the Spanish and the American colonizers. These are Quezon's words in that famous speech. Fernando Zobel would one day re-edit himself this poem, as we will see later. But in 1946, when he was invited by Zulueta to participate, he was only 22 years old and had only written a bunch of poems. So Zulueta invited him to collaborate, and Zóbel did, but surprisingly, not with one of his original poems or compositions, but with a translation, the translation of a poem of whom? A poem of Federico Garcia Lorca, who was a poet that Zulueta had been enthusiastically reading at least since I found 1934. So Zulueta was reading Lorca in Manila before anybody else, not even in Latin America, probably. Considering him, that was Zulueta thought of Zóbel, of Lorca as some sort of a model for a new modern Filipino literature. Now, Zóbel's choice is interesting for at least two, maybe even three reasons. One, it is a translation, and translation was being an intrinsic quality of Filipinos' identity on the one hand, but also of Fernando Zobel's work as a painter on the other. Two, it is a work of Federico Garcia Lorca, the famous poet and playwright shot by the fascists at the beginning of the Spanish Civil War, which I believe does not take much effort to read as a response to Franco's efforts to extend his regime's influence over the Philippines in the years previous to the World War II. This is an episode that's been greatly studied by Florentino Rodao and very well documented. He used particularly the Falange, the fascist branch of his regime. And you could, by the way, you can see here on the screen Lorca with his very good friend of his youth, no other than Salvador Dalí. And this was a strategy in which Franco first counted with the support of Zobel's own father, Enrique Zóbel, and among other Filipino oligarchs. So the connection was very strong, and he's clearly making here a statement, right? But it's also important to remember that this support of these oligarch families, including the Zóbel to Franco in the early years of the war, came drastically to an end with the invasion of the Philippines by Japan in 1941, and there was no connection that I know of after the war. So we've given two reasons. Maybe give you the third reason that makes this poem interesting and that he was chosen for his translation, and it is that it might not be a coincidence that the poem itself that Zóbel chose from Lorca was the Romance of the Spanish Civil Guards, the Romance de la Guardia Civil, which is a poem, beautiful poem. I mean, Lorca is just an amazing poet, telling the story of a violent police raid on a local Andalusian community of gypsies, gitanos in Spanish. So it is a story about race or ethnicity and repression, and it would have been difficult to be reminded of other episodes in the history of the Philippines by the Filipino readership. So Fernando Zobel was not anymore in Manila, however, when the Filipino contemporary verse and prose came out in September 1946. By January 1946, Zobel had already left Manila and had embarked in the long view victory. You can see a little sketch or caricature of it in the bottom top left, the ship that would take him to Seattle to travel by train afterwards to Massachusetts, where he would begin as a freshman at Harvard University, February 1946. And the letter, by the way, illustrates the turbulence of the sea voyage, which is something that he did so frequently in his letters. I'm planning to have an edition of these letters, selection of these letters published with Christopher Maurer. I hope this project comes to be made. So Zobel would remain at Harvard for the next 5 years, an experience that was completely transformative in his own words. Moreover, it is thanks in a great part to the Harvard archives at the Houghton Library that it is possible today to reconstruct his fascinating life, and particularly this time of his life. Here we see, so the letter that you're seeing was sent to Paul Haldeman, who was a member of the consulate in Manila, that would later donate to the Harvard Art Museums and the Houghton Library all the documents that he had collected over 30 years of friendship with Fernando Zobel. So it's an incredible archive. By the way, surprise, it's funny enough, Paul Haldeman later moved to Somerville, And here, this is a picture that Fernando took of him in his house at Somerville, and he's wearing a tie that was designed or drawn by Fernando Zobel. He was had this kind of a good sense of humor. So this was this one case, right? Paul Haldeman. Another case is, of course, that of Philip Hofer. Another case of those that had made possible to make this research. Philip Hofer was the first curator of prints and drawings at the Houghton Library. He was his mentor in the art of collecting books, and he was the person that hosted Zobel for an internship at the Houghton Library in 1915 after he graduated. And this is a fragment from a letter at the Houghton that Zobel writes to him from Madrid to Boston, 1975. And I use this for the biography I wrote for the Harvard Gazette, but let me repeat this because I think it's particularly beautiful and touching to the people here in Cambridge. Above is a bit of Harvard from memory. I mean, really from memory. No photos. I'd like to be kind of exercising what's left visually, probably much looser than the above and larger, of course, but not big. The thing up there is a bit of Charles in Autumn. Anything like an exercise in line plus color plus memory. A kind of Arcadia, I suppose. The Harvard memories are pretty idyllic in retrospect. Since we remember as unchanging, because there we changed, as Auden more or less put it. The letters by Zobel are all filled with this kind of amazing quotes and observations. My third case, and I'm using this also to thread my story, is the case of Dave Perkins. He was a professor in the English department. He retired many years ago. He's now in his 90s. I spoke to him recently over the phone, and Dave Perkins also collected all his documents and donated to the Houghton. This picture, I think that I found in one little box, is one that was probably taken by David Perkins himself the same year that Zobel came to Cambridge. So please allow me to go briefly over these years, which part of this research has been presented in a book they have co-written with Luis Francis Cifuentes and Christopher Maurer. But I have been able to expand with many other documents that I found the last year, this research that we've got to present in these to you today. So while the law does not still permit us to have a full access to Zobel's student records, his diaries and letters and other documents have permitted us to reconstruct his curriculum. The final document that I came across was this scrapbook that Zobel put together in between 1947 and 1949. And which shows all the professors that he was taking classes with other caricatures. So I think it's a document of history of this institution, right? To the bottom, so top left, we see Professor Maurice that was teaching the French 19th century poem. Bottom right, just below an old caricature of Zobel himself, we see Professor Rollins that was teaching a class that he took in the early Romantics. And please look at the grades. This is the only B+ that I found. All of the rest, at the time there were no grade inflation, are all A's. Now go another page and we see Professor Knapton, for example, top left, where I was teaching a history of the Great Revolution, and to the bottom top right, sorry, the professor, I don't know who it was. I know only have the caricature, but I know that he took a class with him in the Great Russian novels. This is, and again, an A, and as many others. And of course, he did take a class in art history in my department. And you know what? I found the notes from the class that he was taking, not the professors, but his own whole volume. And this from a class that he took with Benjamin Rowland on American art. And he was going over the 19th century and 20th century painting. And I'm showing it to you with the magic lantern, because this is how he would have been following these classes, right? So with the magic lantern, the old projector, these black and white large slides. By the way, the one that you're seeing is the actual slide that was projected on that day in that class. And know this because it was kept in the archives, and these were very expensive slides. So when you borrowed one of these slides for your class, you had to put your name on it and the date, so they will ensure they will be returned to the archives. So I know this. I know this a little bit of a fetishism of an art historian, but I think I love doing this research. And of course, he did not fail to be captivated by Sargent's Jaleo at the Isabella Gardner that you're seeing now, and that he, of course, made a drawing. And this is important because in this time, Zobel learned to look and paint as two simultaneous activities. So learning to see so that he would learn how to paint, and learning to paint so that he could learn how to see. So there's two sides of one of the same personality. The artist and the academic come together as two sides of one the same coin. And this is what's unique about the personality of Fernando Zobel. And I hope to show that this reflects in the quality of his work. So while it is clear that Zobel was not even considering becoming an artist, he was at the time probably thinking more of being an academic, if not even a librarian. That's what comes out in his diaries. By the way, we have the complete diaries by Zobel. I keep on saying Goya, of Zobel between 1947 and 1984, which are completely unpublished. So you can perfectly follow, his life. He was a very organized man. So, and it's thanks to these things, we know that he had a particular gift for drawing from very early age, particularly in the genre of caricature that he continued practicing at Cambridge. This aspect is still little known, but I find it particularly charming, but also not only charming, but interesting. Here to the left, you see the mural paintings that he painted for the Fox Club, a club that he joined in his sophomore year. These exact wall paintings do not exist anymore, but if you ever get the chance to go into the Fox Club, which is at Harvard Square, they have some others, beautiful paintings that Zobel did for them in the 1940s. But he did also many other caricatures that were published, or I found published at the Harvard Alumni Bulletin, and many of them were published between 1949 and 1951. And I cannot show you all of them, but let me show one of them in particular. This is the almanac that he made and published in 1950 on the occasion of the opening of the Harkness Center. That is what at the time was called the Casper Student Center at the law school. Actually, Zobel was enrolled at the law school for one semester, precisely when Walter Gropius celebrated the opening of this building. So it was connected to Walter Gropius. And the interesting thing is that this was a construction that was polemically celebrated or welcomed as the arrival of modernity to campus. And Zobel engaged in these conversations, participating in this debate by making this almanac, which is on the occasion of the main sculpture by Richard Leopold that you can see at the entrance of the building, right? So Zobel continued painting in Cambridge under the influence of the European artists that he had come across in Boston, whether it was Hyman Bloom, you might be familiar with the artist, or, for example, Georg Gross. Georg Gross, you might remember, is the German émigré that moved from Berlin to New York in 1937, in 1942, I believe. He was an artist that visited Cambridge in those years because he was invited by Walter Gropius to exhibit at the German Museum. And as you can see on the center of the image, you see one of the caricatures that Zobel was making. This is a very ironic critical eye. Is a critique of the art critic who needs a book to find the explanation of the painting itself. It doesn't rely on is not confident enough of his own eyes. Needs to have some text to explain things. And it very much reflects what he had seen at that exhibition here in Cambridge, the work of Georg Gross, the painter of the hall, that we know that was a version of it was exhibited on that occasion, this 1950. And to the right, you see Georg Gross' own autobiography dedicated to Fernando Zobel. You see to Fernando Zobel with best greetings, Georg Gross, 1949. So the whole watercolor was made for him. So he became immersed in this amazing world that was Cambridge in the 1940s. But his main interest, however, remained in the study of literature. Not surprisingly, it was the work of Federico García Lorca, the poet that had already translated in Manila in 1946, that allowed Zóbel to bring these two interests that had grown in him, literature and painting, to bring them together. And here's the evidence. In the scrapbook that we're looking at before, we see in the middle this black and white painting, of which I found a modern color reproduction, although I don't know what the what is still today. And this painting is named, that's the name that he gave to it, a las 5 de la tarde, at 5 in the afternoon. That's the title of a poem by Federico García Lorca, The Lament on the Death of the Bullfighter Ignacio Sánchez Mejías. And he's making this tribute to Lorca now in this very Picassion kind of style. More important, however, is that Lorca was a model for him because Lorca was himself a draftsman, and many of his poems were illustrated, and they were illustrated in this kind of surrealist style that will remind us, of course, of the connections to Salvador Dalí. More important, however, is that Zóbel wrote several papers for his classes in comparative literature on Federico García Lorca. And these were written for no other than Harry Levine, who was the greatest comparativist at the time, not only at Harvard, maybe in North America. And it was for a class that he took with Harry Levine that he wrote first a translation of one of the plays by Federico García Lorca, Don Perlimplín, but even his senior thesis on Lorca's Lorca's drama. But he did more than just translate and write on Federico García Lorca. Of course, Harry Levine probably had no idea who Lorca was. Who become, of course, one of the greatest poets of the 20th century at the time. That's been revealed to him by Lorca, by Zóbel. But the interesting thing is when he handed out the paper to Levine, he discovered that it had also been illustrated. He had illustrated his paper with several watercolors that betray the influence of the masters of the Bauhaus, with which Zóbel had come in contact in Cambridge, as we just saw, thanks to the exhibitions organized at the German Museum, among others by Walter Gropius. Now, if the illustrations of Don Perlimplín, even if might look naive to you, reflect the careful formal analysis of such Bauhaus artists as Paul Klee, that we know Zóbel was at the time intensely studying and reading. His critical analysis, as it shows in the paper that he wrote for Harry Levine, reflects the influence of the new criticism that he learned under the guidance of Levine himself. That is, the close reading of the poem as a self-contained object separated from its context. And of course, behind Harry Levine here is the shadow cast by no other than T.S. Eliot, the master of new criticism. And these are two caricatures that Zóbel made of T.S. Eliot, whom he met here at Cambridge in 1947 when he came to give some lectures. Zóbel admired the work of T.S. Eliot, and many of his quotes become kind of mantras for his own thinking already in the 1940s, like this one that he copied in one of his sketchbooks. The historical sense involves a perception not only of the pastness of the past, but of its presence. The past should be altered by the present as much as the present is directed by the past. And I think this what I'm calling a mantra is something that worked for Zóbel, both to think historically, chronologically, the past and the present, but also geographically, as putting kind of dialogues across different geographies. So it was this intellectual and artistic language that Fernando Zóbel returned with to Manila in 1951, where he would remain and settled working for the family company until 1959, when he finally moved to Madrid, only returning occasionally to the Philippines until his death in 1984. And what you're now seeing is a self-portrait that he made the year after he arrived to Manila, with a Chinese seal with his name on his shirt that he had made for him in Hong Kong. It was in these years that Zóbel slowly decided to become a painter, developing his unique style and technique of the Serie Negra that he would present later at the end of his period at the Guggenheim in 1960 in New York. So art historians have traditionally explained this kind of very personal style as the result of his encounter, as I said before, with the abstract expressionism during the brief stay at the Rhode Island School of Design in 1954, particularly the encounter with the work of Mark Rothko, which he certainly admired. But also, as this would have been filtered through his interest in calligraphy. This narrative, the Philippines just make for little more than a transitional parenthesis, right? Nothing happens for him in Manila, right? It's just Spain and Mar Rothko. What would have offered him Manila? So my work that will be shown with you in the next minutes is tentative and preliminary, but I would like to share with you some thoughts because I think that everything comes out of, or much of it comes out of what happened in Manila before. So it should come as no surprise that one of the first things that Zóbel did at his return to Manila was to publish a new edition of the most famous book of his old friend, Zulueta, like the Molave. The first 1941 edition long being out of print and the original manuscript being destroyed with all of Zulueta's library. Unfortunately, everything disappeared during the shelling at the Battle of Manila in 1945. So Zóbel designed a new and, in my personal opinion, beautiful cover and included in it, in the edition, Salvador López's introduction to the 1941 edition, in which Salvador López had celebrated the poem as a symbol of the Philippine struggle to independence. As modern as television, as eternal as light. This is the quote that was chosen to put on the back cover. So when the book came out, Zulueta wrote an article for the Philippines Women's Magazine in which he thanked Zóbel for his interest and was pleased, of course, with the quality of the edition. But now he saw his poem under a very different light than what he had thought when he wrote it 10 years before. And this is what he wrote in that article. I'm quoting it. Personally, I have no quarrel with those who find in Rafael Zulueta da Costa's like the Molave a distillation of the noblest in Philippinism, whatever that may be. By the way, this is Zulueta speaking about himself. So patriotic poetry, regardless of what Salvador López says in his introduction to the book, is not my particular dish. These poems to me are pure poetry, and the subtle injection of original Spanish into English text, sustained length, is done very naturally and effectively, setting a new pattern of poetic expression for the poet of bilingual thought and speech in any clime. And I would like to point out to you, put my emphasis on this idea of the bilingual thought and the integration of Spanish and English, of which here is an example. I speak, let me take this away, I speak English and Spanish and French. I speak foreign languages without accent. I can lisp a little Tagalog. I think the Congo is divine, don't you? I think Shostakovich is brilliant, don't you? We Manilans are really cosmopolitan. Was not Franco the word divine made incarnate? Were not those leftist rats atrocious? Federico Garcia Lorca? Never heard of him. I think there's such a dramatic irony in this poem. So the poem, like many others in the book, including like the Molave, are an expression of what Marlon James Salles has called a linguistic diversity of a nation that has historically imagined itself as multilingual. And I have little doubt that Fernando Zobel would have been reminded when reading these poems again of Zulueta of what he had learned in Harry Levine's classes, right? This idea of the pure poetry, but also probably of T.S. Eliot's own poetry, this idea of the translingual that T.S. Eliot also very often used. So let me get, sorry. So the Philippines, briefly, sorry, as an intralinguistic bubble, in the words of Vicente Rafael. So I am an art historian. I'm not a literary historian, so I don't have a say on the literary background that I'm presenting. But as an art historian, Zulueta's comments remind me of the work of Fernando Zobel himself, the work that Fernando Zobel developed in those same years in the field of art history in the search for what he called a Filipino artistic expression. In an article published in the Philippine Studies in 1953, Fernando Zobel asked precisely that question: what is it, a Filipino artistic expression? And the article opens with this statement: during a period of intense nationalism, such as the one that the Philippines are passing through at the present moment, it is natural and even healthy that a search be made in every direction to discover what can, with pride, be pointed out as being truly Filipino. Now, the trouble is that at this early stage of the search, we are not quite sure what we mean by the words. At least some of us are not, and we feel that it might be worthwhile to try and put our thoughts into some sort of focus. That is the purpose and the sole purpose of this essay. Of course, the moment, it is not only the moment of the field, but a moment of the nation, right? Of the search for an identity, right? So Zobel left the question open with this formula: object minus foreign influence or influences equals residue, which is a Filipino expression we hope to find. Now, in the next years, Zobel wrote several articles, and even including a book, in which he followed the same strategy, the same plan, that of trying to find a Filipino distinctive expression along two main arguments: its translinguistic character, which is not what a naturalist will probably be doing, and two, exploring how local Filipino artists translated what Zobel called foreign influences in an irreducible, distinctive style, a form of expression. Now, the book, this Filipino religious imagery, brought several examples that he studied as works of art of profound beauty, works that were commissioned by the church, but had been made by local Filipino artists whose ethnicity was most often impossible to document. Give you one example. This is part of the preparatory drawings that he made for the book, but this comes from the book itself. And this is my example, is the Our Lady of the Rosary, La Virgen del Rosario, also known in Manila as La Naval. And as Zobel's text says, it was carved by a pagan Chinese craftsman from Ilocos under the direction of the Spanish captain, his name Don Hernando de los Rios Coronel. And Zobel was able to date the sculpture. Actually, this chronology is still the one used in the literature between 1593 and 1598. So the image of the Virgin, the heads and arms were carved in ivory by a Chinese artist from Fujian, but it was commissioned and finished by Christian artists for a Catholic brotherhood. And Fernando Zobel adds, non-occidental influences being by no means difficult to detect in the image, which is kind of obvious. While Fernando Zobel presented the Virgin of del Rosario as an example of Filipino expression, its story is not one of syncretism, I'm sorry. As recently described by Christina Lee in her 2022 book, Saints of Resistance, a fabulous book, by the way, the story of the craftsman that made the Virgen del Rosario did not end up here. As told by a 1640 chronicle, the Chinese Sanglai, as they were called, artists, later converted to Christianity precisely in front of the same image that he himself had made, and the confraternity that was founded on her name would only admit Spaniards, never natives, being completely segregated racially. So in spite of this, and of course Zobel knew this, but he doesn't get into his story, it's in the same chronicle that he used. But in spite of this, Zobel's consideration of these santos as works of art allowed him to discern the Filipino expression as the result of a cultural palimpsest, to which different ethnicities or cultures had contributed in the course of 3.5 centuries, since Miguel López de Legazpi established the first permanent colonial settlement in the archipelago by 1568. Now, Zobel's interesting, while highly problematic conclusions, as you can see in the analysis of Filipino saints, find an enlightening parallel in his work as a painter. Beginning in 1953, the same year of his article, Zobel had returned intensely to the practice of painting. He was working during the day, so would paint early in the morning and late in the afternoon. And this This is what he wrote to Paul Haldeman, the guy in Somerville with the funny tie, in one letter that I found at the Houghton. So all in all, the spirit shrinks a bit, and I keep it alive by shutting myself up and painting. I find I cannot paint those careful, multi-textured things I used to do in emulation of Reed and Hyman Bloom. I paint big, bright, simple, and flashy. It gives me a boost, something like pulling myself up, Munchausen house-like, by the hair. Perhaps you would like these rather aggressive pictures of mine. I think that the enjoyment I have in making them somewhat remains in the finished product. And in this neurotic age, the simple pleasure may perhaps strike someone, some not being a meritorious originality. Hein, say yes. I like this exchange with a friend, right? Simpler pleasure, how to paint for looking for enjoyment. So it was precisely in this year, 1953, that Zóbel finished La Carroza, a painting that he somehow reinvented the colonial imaginary as described in the novels of the national hero and martyr, José Rizal. Actually, José Rizal is cited in the book. But this colonial past that was reflected in José Rizal's novels was here reimagined with the modern Parisian style of late Cubism. And this painting received, and this is important, the first prize of the Art Association of the Philippines, 1953, which was a great triumph because this association considered nationalism, traditionally considered nationalism as the fundamental character to be awarded, which they saw symbolized the association in the works of such painters as Fernando Amorsolo, who, by the way, had been protected by his father, Enrique Zobel, in many ways. Now, opposite to Amorsolo's Parisian models dressed in Philippine costume, this is actually Zobel's comment on Amorsolo. In his own works, Zobel refused to look for the Filipino expression in an indigenous world located beyond history, and looked instead for inspiration in the real history of the Philippines. That is, looking for the Filipino expression first in its cosmopolitan and transcultural nature, as argued recently by Patrick Flores, and two, as this imaginary world was projected not into the past, but into the future, a decolonizing voice that struggled to move into modernity with the burden of history. And these are now the words of Charlie Samujaveric, that I think has written great things on Zobel. And what you're now seeing is the 1954 self-portrait in which Zobel's presence is being replaced by a Rovak chair, that is the drawing chair that was produced for the drawing classes at the Bauhaus in Dessau. So in this kind of tropical image with the trees coming into the window, the furniture comes from the Bauhaus. So his first two, 1953 and 1954 solo exhibitions at the Philippine Art Gallery in Manila, show that by then Zobel might have not yet found a style, but he certainly had found an itinerary to follow, and that walking on an acrobat's tightrope, as Rafael Zulueta told him in a poem to which I will come back in a minute, would be some sort of his destiny. So the year 1954, Zobel decided to take some time off, leave Manila, and take some courses at Rhode Island School of Design with the conviction of devoting himself and his life to painting. Traditionally, again, this has been explained as a turning point in his career, as it allowed him for, again, the encounter with the master, Mark Rothko. Well, the importance of this artistic experience in the modeling of Zobel's character is undeniable. It ignores another important, maybe more important aspect of his personality that I have been trying to explore in today's lecture, that is Zobel as a scholar. So we always think of Zobel as a painter, but there's another half of him, which is Zobel the scholar. And the two sides are just complementary to each other. You cannot think of one without the other. And that's important for Zobel himself, but it's important for an artist that is unique. Who other artists in the mid-20th century had these two sides, and this education of the one that he had like Zobel, right? And this makes it unique, interesting, and also very challenging. But at least, this, by the way, is the quote that I was using before, walking on the acrobat's tightrope, poem by Zulueta. At least since 1956, Zóbel developed an important activity as lecturer at the Ateneo University in Manila. He gave different courses with the generous goal of sharing his experience and knowledge acquired at Harvard with the people interested. And there were all kinds of people taking his classes. I mean, I have the list of them, and there are artists, there are architects, people of all kinds. Now, the notes from his class on Chinese and Japanese art have been preserved. They're in Madrid. And not surprisingly, this did not only cover the history of the art from its origins, but put also a particular emphasis in strictly contemporary post-war Japanese paintings, including, of course, calligraphy as an abstract art. Calligraphy as an abstract art, the role of intelligibility, calligraphy as an abstract art, the effect of calligraphy on the West, the effect on calligraphy on the West, development of abstract calligraphy in Japan. By the way, these courses were the first time, these class notes are from 1960, but the first time it was taught, it was 1956. So he's developing this interest in calligraphy way before these things arrived to the US, in the big exhibition at the MoMA, 1954, or later European artists coming to Japan to study calligraphy, like Alechinsky and others, right? So he's unique. He's not only earlier, he's coming from the Philippines, but not from the West. And this inverted sense of direction, I think, it is also telling. For lacking proper slides to project in his classes, Zobel used reproductions that he pasted in some pages and then have been distributed in class, like this from the calligrapher Veda Sokyu, actually the professor of Morita Shiryu, who was one of the greatest advocates of the renovation of calligraphy. His class notes include, of course, the names of two other Japanese artists that we have come across before, Munakata Shiko, whose work he would later donate to the Art Museums, and of course Morita Shiryu, right, student of Veda Sokyu, and the founder of the People of the Ink in 1952. Now, writing to his old friend again, and for the last time, Paul Haldeman in 1959, he shared this new enthusiasm, this discovery. Life wanders on. The office gets more hectic, more active, more important every year. At home, I paint, not in a rush like in Cape Cod, but consistently and well. I learn to read, not speak and write Chinese. I love this. A new world, a new way of expressing thought, so different that it affects the very quality of thoughts. An ideal exercise for the painter. If you can control a Chinese brush, surely you can control anything. And then there's some what looks apparently like Chinese, but at the right says nonsense. Just an impulse to scribble. Such a lovely way to write. I think there's this kind of charming honesty. He was never pedantic, which I like. So the sketchbooks produced in these years, there are 126 preserved, all of them unpublished, give testimony of his study of both Chinese calligraphy and Chinese painting. But this is not what interests me, however, because I'm not, of course, a specialist on this. What interests me is the obsession itself with languages, and with translation in particular. Compulsion that, as a Filipino, I have been arguing, had shaped his very way of looking into the world and into culture. And here, for example, is, have a look, translating Chinese into English, right? But with Greek characters. And I think there are two Confucius idioms. I had the help of Gigi Liang. The Greek reads now, not know words, not know when, how to use the one underneath. Is it not delightful to have a friend home from afar? I think the one that should read something like, you cannot know the person without knowing their speech. And I love this page particularly because it speaks about, it brings two key elements in his personality. That is the love for languages and translation on the one hand, but also the importance of friendship. And friendship built all the connections that make him travel across the world. So it is not an anecdote in his personality. It's much more than that. Interestingly enough, however, this was not something specific of an Asian influence, but it was something of Zobel's deepest personality, his way to travel through space and time, geography and history. Maybe you have recognized the image that we're seeing now. I give you a hint. It's El sueño de la razón produce monstruos. The dream of reason produces monsters. And this is actually what's written here. In Greek, looks like Greek. This is only the alphabet Greek. The rest is, of course, Spanish, right? And I think there's something beautiful also in choosing this image. So please do not get me wrong. I'm aware there is something just playful, even childish about these language games. I do believe, however, that this imaginary of translation, I'm going to be calling it this way, imaginary of translation, that he acquired and developed during his early years in Manila, completely shaped his personality, and to us, or for us, it helps us to understand some of his best paintings, like those of the Serie Negra, the black paintings with which I started my talk. Paintings that, as I said, are rapidly executed while following a well-meditated plan, excluding improvisation. This tension, in fact, was discussed by him to his students at the lectures that he was giving in Manila, in particular the lecture outlines for the classes that Zobel gave on contemporary painting at the Ateneo in the year 1954-1955, that is 2 years after he returned from Cambridge, come into this issue, right? Here he discussed with his students 3 possible creative processes. The Western classical approach that goes from the sketch to the drawing and then to the painting, it is progressive. Then to the Western spontaneous approach, he says evolution, if any, takes place on the canvas, the automatism. So he's referring to automatism, that is probably mostly to Pollock, but think of the date, we're 1954. And actually Zobel, I came across this by reading his diaries, met Jackson Pollock in New York in late 1954, because of course, Pollock had been hosted by Alfonso Osorio, the Filipino painter that was the cousin of Fernando Zobel. And this connection may get him to get to know Jackson Pollock. But the most interesting thing is the 3 creative process, which is what he calls the spontaneous approach, the method of irrevocable decisions made after meditation, which he calls Oriental, which is obviously what's behind the paintings of the Serie Negra, right? So taught in 1954, Zobel's classes on contemporary painting in Manila conclude with a roadmap of modern art, one only similar to that much more famous made by Alfred Barr. Unlike Alfred Barr's, however, Zobel's begins with 2 splits, 2 cuts, breaking with the past. You can see them there. The other difference with his friend's diagram, by the way, Alfred Barr and Zobel became good friends. The other difference between the 2 diagrams is that in Zobel's, there are roads that then they're open after these splits. And those are the roads that he himself decided to transit in the next 30 years of his life. Accepting the bet Rafael de Zulueta had made him when he got his first solo opening in Manila. Farewell to a beginning. You have shed a mask, and stone will not survive unbled under the stroke of light and shadow, fleur and grim obituary. You are aware, the rest is walking on a tightrope where, all nets removed, you face the hushed forlorn of crystal meanings trembling to be born. This is a poem that Zulueta da Costa wrote to him and dedicated to him on the occasion of his first Manila solo opening. I only know it is never included in the anthologies of Zulueta. I found this copy in his papers in Madrid. So I have only shown you, I'm coming to an end, I have only shown you paintings by Zobel from 1954 to roughly 1960, 1962. But I can assure you that the next 20 years of Zobel's life prove that he took Rafael Zulueta's bet to heart. Zobel's career as an artist was always that of walking on an acrobat's tightrope, a life of continuous, sustained experimentation, all nets removed, as Zulueta told him. I said artist, but I should have just said painter. So let me leave you with one final quote taken from one of his unpublished diaries. I don't like being an artist. The role bothers me. I like to paint. Being an artist interferes with painting. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Felipe. That was, wow, what a tour of an amazing life. I mean, these connections, it always just blows me away how we hear about certain of these types of figures that have interacted and probably, at the time, isn't aware of who these, all these figures, who they would become perhaps, or you're just part of a kind of a movement in a social circle, an artistic circle, a world where you're just meeting some of the key figures that would go on to be so important. And he's in the mix of it all, it seems like. I wonder if maybe you can unshare your screen.
Oh, sorry.
It's a lovely. I love that photograph by Ron Dinks though too. It's a fabulous one. But there we go. Now we can see. So let me invite everybody, anybody who's here to post any questions that you might have in using the Q&A box. And I was also, this is actually a very timely talk that you've given, given the exhibition that was at the Prado, also given that Harvard has finally been approved now. We will have a Filipino language teacher in the fall, which is also exciting. And then you also cited Vicente Rafal's work, who gave a talk in this series just in the fall term as well. So this is, you've sort of brought it all to a very nice close. So while I'm waiting for others to think of questions they might want to ask you, the one thing that really stuck out to me was one point that you made about Zobel's and this notion of him developing an acute skill for seeing in order to paint, but then painting in order to see. I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that and how it is reflected, or how you see it maybe reflected in some of his art. It's a very intriguing, he seemed like a very, you have this range of real abstract kind of, or abstraction of the reality that we might perceive. But then he also has those kind of caricature type paintings as well. And so he's kind of taking the whole spectrum across of different types of representation. So I'd just be curious if you had any more thoughts on that, because it's a really intriguing comment, I thought.
Thank you. So let me say, what I did today is connected to what we did at the exhibition at the Prado, but the Prado exhibition was covering another very different facet of his work, which was all about this idea of connecting seeing and painting. So the whole idea, this obsession of Zobel, that you have to learn how to see, and you only learn how to see by drawing. And this is, so when I was saying that there are two sides of his personality, the academic or the scholar, or the historian and the artist, and you have to consider the two together. This exactly, it comes down to this connection of looking and painting. So much the reason the exhibition went to the Prado is because much of his work, although abstract or informalist, very often has in the background or in its origins a composition by an old master. So there are 126 sketchbooks because Zobel loved going to museums and making drawings of the works of other artists. These do not evidently reflect in what he's making, but very often you can trace back the composition to an image by another artist. So he thought of his work as being as a kind of not a transcultural, but a transhistorical dialogue with the works of the old masters. And in order to do this, he needs first to draw the work of such a master. Then he would then understand the painting, and that will oftentimes lead into a composition by his own. So that history is embedded into his own creative process. There's no other, so there are other artists, of course, that did similar things in the 20th century, right? I mean, making drawings of other masters. No other artist that I know of, I think is completely unique in the 20th century, made this part of his creative process, an intrinsic part of it. And why? Again, well, because he's part of a scholar at the same time. That doesn't mean that his work is in any way giving a response to how we should look into the works of these masters. So say when he gets a whole sketchbook on a painting by Velázquez, no, it is his own way of speaking to those artists, to speak to tradition. And this could be, you know, artists from Western European artists, or will be Asian artists. He knew a lot and studied a lot of both Japanese and Chinese paintings, and had an immense library of these, which is today in Madrid.
That would be really interesting to look through. In a sense, he's kind of reverse engineering, in a sense, what they're doing, perhaps even in looking into it. Did he? I was really again struck by his fondness and then use of, or influenced by Munakata Shiko as well, who I've seen some wonderful exhibitions of that in Japan over the last number of years, and had sort of a resurgence say about 10 years ago, and big collections that were shown. Did he ever travel or spend time in China or Japan?
So he traveled. So he went many times to Hong Kong, and traveled at least twice that I know of to Japan. And he has 2 sketchbooks actually that are just devoted to Japan. So we know about the people that he met. He doesn't mention meeting Munakata Shiko. I know that it was not only about this painting. I know that he admired him personally, because you might know his nephew, Peter Soriano, who actually curated once an exhibition on Zóbel here at Harvard, told me that remember very well how Zóbel had this, spoke highly of Munakata Shiko to him. So I know he really was very much interested in, so that he donated this specific scroll landscape to the Harvard museums, that it also shows up in his class notes. They both come together. Moreover, I didn't mention this, but Zóbel started doing wood cut printing. Since the 1940s. Actually, he learned the technique here already at Harvard. Philip Hofer, the curator of drawings and prints at the Houghton, taught him the technique. And he was, throughout his life, he always collected prints. Unfortunately, these have not come down to us, although I don't know where they are, but I know he collected lots of prints, and he practiced printing himself. So the interest in Munakata Shiko makes complete sense.
Yeah. It also displays that kind of range all the way from more caricature type forms that you find, and then all the way to the more abstract type that you find in the Chinese landscape, or even calligraphic forms as well.
Let me have to give just a footnote on this. So Zóbel never gave up drawing caricatures. He did that the rest of his life. The thing is that he had his artistic personality is kind of split. So he was an abstract artist on the one hand, continued to do caricatures, continued to do prints, but also he was a great photographer. He kept these different languages completely separate, because he thought that there were different objects needed for different language, but also for different technique. So he kept them completely separate. Interesting.
So we have one question that was asking about the prominence of lines in Zobel's later paintings compared to his earlier paintings. It seems to also suggest that there is a turn to the pen from the brush, but maybe you've answered this here. Let's see. He says, or if we can think of the pen as the stand-in for the literary, the intellectual, and the literal word making in making diaries, while the brush is a metaphor for the realm of expression of artistic experiences. Would this be a valid observation? So thinking of the different medium.
I think it is. If I understand it correctly, it is a great thought. I like showing you the diaries for one reason. Do you see how neat and clear the calligraphy is?
Unbelievable. His writing is incredible. I mean, it's nice to be, for you as somebody working in the archives, it's actually very easy to read.
Exactly.
So I don't need to
transcribe the documents. I can just show them to you. And he never makes any mistake. Rarely do you find anything being erased. So he paints almost like an intellectual. So thought and emotions are so well embedded and into one way of looking into things. So there is something literary about his painting. not just something painterly about his thought. Definitely, the two were well connected.
Yeah. Once I was working in a library as an undergraduate, and somebody saw how horribly ineligible my own handwriting was, and said, "Hey, can you read really bad handwriting?" And I said, "Yes." And there was a project to transcribe the handwritten diaries of Thoreau, and so I ended up spending time, because I can actually read really poorly written things as well. But his is just crystal clear, lovely script. Yeah.
So actually, for the publication that I'm planning, I think that many of them, we would transcribe them, but you don't really need to. It is the beauty of the page they want to look at, right? And
yeah. So embedded in much of what you said, there's clearly a number of issues of the transnational nature of Zobel's life, moving between America, Europe, the Philippines, and throughout Asia, but also at very important junctures in history of all of those places. And so Nicole Aboitiz, who also gave a talk in this series in the first year of it, asked a question just about, in terms of thinking about the larger stakes of the research of this work on Zobel, and what kind of debates emerge out of that, or how you situate him and his work in terms of these larger kinds of questions. Clearly somebody caught up in a lot of this important time periods.
Yeah. So this talk was very, as I was saying, tentative and experimental. So at the exhibition of the Prado, we decided to present him as just as a cosmopolitan artist, which was something that it is true. You remember Zulueta saying, "We Manilans are cosmopolitan." But it was also, I would confess, a way to sidestep some of these political debates in which we'll get involved, right? And when preparing this exhibition, the problem of Zobel's identity continued to be raised as an issue, right? So from Manila and from Madrid, it is seen as completely two different people, right? And their families themselves have different obvious understandings of his identity. I think that there maybe it's not going to be an answer, because I'm just kind of summarizing what I'm saying. But to me, for this new venue in Singapore and then in Manila, it offers the opportunity to think of two important things. One would be to what extent Zobel's own way to confront the problem of nationalism. It is a politically interesting statement that could be of use for other artists, even, right, to help open the debate beyond certain restrictions. And that's one thing. So I do think he's actively engaging in politics and presenting his own response to that through his own work and through his own research. The other, as an art historian, maybe the other more important for me thing for me to see is that when I read, I'm not a contemporary specialist, art specialist, and so I know about my limitations. But when I always read about the interest in Asian calligraphy, I always see this in described from the perspective of the West. So it is, how much Pollock knew about Morita Shiryu, or what did Alechinsky did. So it's always about these people that make some sort of kind of a artistic cultural tourism into Japan, and they get something back for them. So the narrative goes only one way. It is true that some of the people from the group of the Bokunjai group would have connections to with Klein, the people, but the narrative mostly runs from the west to the east. And what I think that Zobel offers you is the opposite, the possibility of running on the opposite direction. He comes to the west through Asia, so he's bringing calligraphy to the West, right? So I think it opens the possibility of rethinking the politics behind these cultural dialogues in a way that to me is more even or equal, if you will, or balanced, right?
Mhm.
And so there is a kind of a political subtext, I think, in the way that I would like to present this dialogue, as Zobel at least gives me this opportunity. So the fact that he would be learning Chinese, I know that he gave up at a certain point because he didn't have time to do so many things, particularly when he moves to Spain. So he takes things seriously. He respects the traditions and that he's studying. He doesn't just use them for his own.
Mhm.
So it's this kind of intense sense of alterity that it is very political, I think.
Mhm. Yeah. I mean, I guess if we're talking about, these different types of flows, the question that obviously comes to mind then is the backflow then. So you have Zobel, he's producing some work in Manila and then quite prolifically when he moves to Madrid then as well, right? And so what kind of what was the sort of echo of Zobel in both of those places? Were there different, and as far as you can ascertain, the sort of impact of what he had done as it resonates both back in let's say in Asia and the Philippines, or if it had a wider spread throughout other parts of Asia, and then also what in the European context?
So in Manila, it was, I think that it is out of doubt, fundamental. So he created the first contemporary art museum in Manila, the Ateneo, that was founded on his own collection. And
Right.
he supported so many different artists, Manansala, Arturo Luz, the first generation of modern artists after World War II in Manila. They're all supported or work around the world that Zobel has been creating and attend his lectures. And he's doing this with a great generosity, which is kind of unique. He's not asking for anything back. So this activity, I think, completely changed the world in Manila at the time. As for Spain, that's funny because I came from this I thought at the beginning, going from Spain, of course I know who Zobel is, right? Zobel is a kind of popular guy in Spain. He not only founded the first contemporary art museum in Manila, he founded the first contemporary art museum in Spain. So the first contemporary museum to open in Spain, the abstract art museum in Cuenca, was his own private collection that was later donated to the Fundación Juan March. So he created he opened a window into a world that was pretty great at the time in Spain. At the same time, when I was saying I thought I knew who Zobel is, in Spain, Zobel's work has been explained, taught, and very much received as kind of a marginal figure of the big avant-garde in Spain. That was a rich guy that had a collection and shared all his book with the good artists. In my opinion, he is by far the most interesting artist of his generation. He's the most complex, the most subtle, the most learned and interesting artist of his generation. I think we have just failed to understand the complexity of his work, and we have failed. We try to frame him within the context of Spain, and that's not his world. His world is global. This is a guy that will be, because he could afford it, of course. He will be traveling, every year, many times, coming all the time back to New England to visit his friends in Cambridge, going, of course, to Manila, where he has his family and his mother, including, right, and traveling all across the world. So I think we've tried to we've cut Zobel into pieces: a piece in Manila, a piece in New England, a piece in Spain. No, what's interesting is what comes out of bringing all these pieces together. And we just were blind in a way to understand its complexity.
Yeah. Well, I actually kind of like that as a nice place to sort of draw this together and to a close, Felipe. I think that's a really nice sort of resituating it in this cosmopolitan context is fascinating. And also, I had forgotten, in a sense, when I asked that question, I had been kind of forgotten his role in establishing museums on both sides, opposite sides of the world here, and which even brings another kind of meaning to the exhibition of this phrase which you adopted from one of his passages about the future of the past, right? In a sense, one can see, I mean, that's what museums do in a sense, right? And for him presenting, but also creating that future by showing the importance of what's come before and getting it preserved. So thank you very much for this. Wow, it's just a really fabulous, interesting tour through or walk down his path with thinking of those map drawings that he did, where you took us through his life and work. So thank you very much for that. I'd also like to just, as we draw this series for this academic year to a close, just give a big thank you to Tenzin Nodap, who has been the really incredible assistant helping with so many things for this. So thanks to him. And then thank everybody for signing on this evening. And we hope that you will be able to join us next year. And Felipe, I very much look forward to seeing how this project evolves. And actually, I'd love to see more of the works. I mean, the connections of how much of this is actually preserved in the Houghton Library and at Harvard too. It's and in the museum as well. There's actually one last. Does RISD have much of any of his works as well from the time that year in 50? Yeah, nothing.
No, not that I know of in at the RISD. No, but we have pretty good stuff here in Cambridge, right? But not there. No. Now the big market is in Asia, so many of his paintings, whenever they come out in the market, they go to.
Interesting. There you see the kind of backflow, sort of interest or interesting kind of in our sort of modernity now of what's happening in that global art world. So. Okay, well, thank you very much again. We're right perfectly at 8:30 here. So hope everybody has a nice and restorative, relaxing summer, and we'll see you back in the fall. So thank you again, Felipe.
Thank you, James. Thank you.
Okay, good night. Good night, everybody.